Hi, Savannah, and thank you for that introduction. I just want to double check. Can everyone see my screen okay?
You are good to go.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you all for attending this webinar. I know that there's a lot of interest these days in resilience. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what resilience means, some of the risks and threats that might be facing your water systems, establishing a framework for planning ahead, or talking about a couple different frameworks you might want to be using, and then going through a quick list of strategies that you can implement in your water system to help make sure it's a bit more resilient. At the very end, hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit about some resources and tools that are available to you to help you in your decision-making process and in your planning process. And then last but not least, we will go ahead and have a quick Q&A session. So resilience, it's the new big buzzword, and what does it even mean? I think everyone sort of sees it as something different. It could be the new sustainability. It could be really thinking about climate change, or if you're going even broader, it's being resilient to any number of threats. At a very basic level, though, resiliency means the ability of a person or an organization to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. And so for you all who work with water systems, you know that disruptions in your utilities is not okay. It can have great and vast impacts. So I think it's easy to think about things when you sort of bundle them together and you have some visual images. So the 4 R's of resiliency. In the top left corner, we're talking about robustness, right? So your the ability of your system to withstand a given level of stress and or demand. How robust is your system? Then we want to talk about redundancy, right? Measure of the inherent substitute. How many pieces of redundancy do you have? How many backups do you have in your system to make sure that if one fails, you're still going to be okay? How resourceful is your system, right? Resourcefulness is a measure of the capacity to mobilize resources in the event of a disruption. Not only are there backups, but if your backup fails, what can you do instead to make sure that your system doesn't go down? And how rapidly can you actually respond to losses or prevent further degradation in a timely manner? So I thought this was a cute way to think about resiliency and with some nice visual aids. So earlier I mentioned that, as you know, your water utilities are very important to basically society as we know it. When water systems go down, things start to drop down significantly. So we're talking about not just the water, but how our hospitals able to run, what's going on with regard to the commercial sector, how are we able to provide the services outside of just water. And so if your systems go down, how quickly can we get them back up so that we don't disrupt society at large? So most commonly when we think about resilience these days, we're thinking about extreme weather events, things that might impact you from a climate change perspective. And so to cover sort of the 2 main threats from weather that most of you will be facing is to talk a little bit about heat, right? So when we are looking at projections and as science gets better, we know that moving forward, even under low emissions, the heat stressors are going to be quite high. That could lead to things like cardiovascular failure or air quality issues. It'll increase airborne diseases and vector-borne diseases and waterborne diseases. And so thinking through what does that mean for your part of the country, right, is going to be incredibly important. In addition to the heat being increased, we know that there's going to be changes in precipitation. And again, depending on where you are in the country, will really mean different things for you. So if you're on the West Coast, you're going to have droughts and fires because precipitation is going to be less. Whereas if you're on the East Coast, you're going to have increased flooding, increased stream flows, and so thinking through what these various threats for your particular geographic region, what those threats are going to look like is going to be very important for the planning process. But despite knowing that these things are happening, resilience can still be a pretty hard sell. No one likes spending money, especially especially when they don't feel they have enough money to begin with. But as time goes on, it will become more costly. So right now, there are a lot of low-cost options or no-cost options that we can start implementing to make sure we're more resilient. But as time continues, the number of options are going to decrease, and then we're going to talk about, damage and recovery costs. So if we aren't preventing it now, it's just going to get more costly as time continues. And what is a discussion about resilience without a nice and quick catastrophe tour? So as you all know, there are great examples of areas of our country that haven't prepared properly or haven't been the most resilient, and as a result have suffered some very large losses. So Katrina is the big one. We know that the levees did not work, the flood walls did not withstand the hurricane, and that caused tremendous amount of property damage and loss of life, and the costs are enormous, right? And so had we prepared properly on the front end, that would not have had the same sort of dire consequences. There's also the Oroville Dam in California. This is another example of a catastrophe that could have been prevented had folks invested on the front end in terms of protecting and preparing their dam. And then there are other issues like Flint, Michigan, where there were concerns about the pipes, and there were not upgrades to the assets, and that has caused all sorts of issues with regards to drinking water in Flint, Michigan. Also in UCLA, it could be something as easy as a water main break, and it can cause flooding that just floods out an entire community. And so how do we protect against these things, and how do we start thinking about and investing in making sure these sort of catastrophes don't happen again in the future? So what can be done, right? Water management faces major challenges: changing climate, urbanization, depletion of resources, and we need to provide a safe, reliable water management system that is resilient to emerging threats. So the first thing we want to do is start framing it out, talking about how are we going to think about these things, and how do we start having these discussions and preparing for the potential threats that are coming down the pipeline. And so the first thing is really to just think about what is an adaptation planning process, and this is one strategy you could think about. Each water and wastewater owner and operator manages their own unique set of assets, and they have their own distinct risk profile. So specific risks and risk management priorities depend on the utility size, the location, and the assets. It's going to look different for everybody. But regardless of whether you're big or small, it's important to consider many different options and the range of benefits offered in order to develop a comprehensive adaptation plan that satisfies the utility needs without overstretching resources. Now, this can be really challenging, and so thinking about it and planning for resilience is really important. So the first step really is to make sure that you have a good understanding of the projected impacts and challenges, right? So thinking through what are your biggest concerns moving forward. Is your community more concerned about climate change? Is your community more concerned about either an increasing urban population, or perhaps you guys are losing customers, and so you're trying to figure out how are you going to pay for services moving forward with a shrinking population. Regardless of what the issue is in your particular community, understanding what those projected impacts and challenges are going to be is step number one. And then you want to do some sort of cataloging of threshold conditions. A threshold condition is basically defining a level at which, as a set of environmental conditions that when that level is exceeded, it's going to cause damage or failure to your operation or equipment, right? So how many customers do you need on your utility in order for you to bring in the sort of income that you need to do your job, right? What is the threshold for population? What's the threshold for heat? At what point is it too hot and you need to think about new strategies for dealing with your utilities, structures, and maintenance? Next, you want to identify the most critical assets and then get a better understanding of what impacts might potentially damage those assets. So you want to do a risk assessment. And this can be as simple as just, again, picking the most critical assets that you think are most vulnerable, or doing a full-scale assessment of every single risk for all the assets that you have. Next, you want to determine what adaptation options you might have. So this is really important because you want to start making sure that you incorporate these adaptation options into existing utility practices, such as capital improvement plans, asset management, capacity building, and emergency response planning. Those things are things that you're doing all the time anyways, and so think about how you can actually build in strategies into that so that you're more resilient in the long run. Also think about those no and low cost options, or those no regret options. And then lastly, once you're done planning, you want to implement and then monitor to see how things are going since you've implemented new strategies, and make new assessments. So we're going to ask you a quick polling question with regard to the planning process and where you guys fall on the spectrum.
So if you could please answer, which steps have you taken towards resiliency planning? Please select from one of the following. Developed and trained staff on the emergency preparedness plan. Analyze projected impacts and challenges. Establish an asset inventory. Identified thresholds of failure in critical assets and the system. Embedded resilience strategies into existing practices. And an example of this could be a capital improvement plan. And we'll leave that poll open for about another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. So Brandy, the majority of our attendees have selected establish an asset inventory, and that's followed by a close 29% to 26% that said they developed and trained staff on the emergency preparedness plan. I'm getting ready to close that poll now.
Well, that's excellent, because the asset management step is critical, right? How do you know what's most vulnerable when you're not even quite sure what exists? So it's comforting to hear that so many of you guys have already completed that step. Okay. So I thought it'd be great to share with you all this framework for thinking about resilience, and specifically thinking through threats, right? And so the University of Exeter in England came up with this safe and sure approach, which really breaks it down, I think, into a rather visual, and like I said earlier, I'm a visual sort of person, so this is helpful for me, but it's a visual approach, right? So thinking about the threats that might be threatening your utility, and how that then affects your system, which if it does affect your system, then will have impacts on service. And then once you have impacts on service, what are the sort of social consequences that will result as a result? And so we're going to think through these 4 steps and what you might be able to do to plan out and think through the resilience issues. So that first step was threat categorization, right? Sitting down with your leadership, sitting down with your managers, and thinking through, well, what are the different types of threats that might impact your system, right? And that means, what are the acute threats, such as maybe a power outage or a natural disaster, or what are the chronic threats, such as insufficient maintenance, or maybe even just lack of investment. Those are chronic issues that you're going to have to deal with, versus internal or external threats. So again, an internal threat would be maybe an accident, right? Some sort of human error in the management process. Or an external threat might be something like climate change. It is something that is outside of you, but that you can prepare for. Sitting down with your partners and sitting down and thinking through the various threats and where they fall on the spectrum can be a very helpful and useful exercise. It also helps to develop a common language, right? So again, chronic versus acute, or internal versus external. It helps so that you can later on figure out where the impacts then fall within these various threats. So the next sort of part of this particular approach is thinking through the system's impacts. So very similarly, we have a matrix where you have on one spectrum functional to structural, and then on the other axis is internal to external. So when you're thinking about an internal functional impact, right, contamination is a very basic one that might happen if there's a threat like a lack of investment in the system. If you're thinking about the functional external, maybe you have a population increase, and so the system impact will be an increased demand for water. For internal and structural, and there you might have insufficient maintenance, and so maybe you'll have a pump failure, and that's the impact on the system itself. Or maybe there's a power outage during a storm, and so you have a power system failure in your utility. Maybe the backup generators didn't work, and so now you are trying to scramble to figure out what do you do next. Well, those system impacts will then lead to service impacts, right? So something happens to your actual system, but that means something to those who rely on that system to begin with. So things like recurrent low-level supply pressure is something that is chronic and something that can be dealt with internally, but that is definitely a service impact that can hurt your ratepayers. Another one is recurrent surface water or flooding from sewers, right? So this is something you might want to consider and plan for. Or maybe you have a contaminated water supply, right? Pipe broke or something of that nature, and so now you have this service impact that you need to take care of. Or even an external acute issue, which is maybe you have water use restrictions because something fell apart. And lastly, think about the consequences, right? So now you've got about the threats that might happen, how that's going to impact your system, how that's going to impact service, and what are those longer term consequences, right? So maybe it's property damage, or maybe agriculture is at a loss because you weren't able to provide sufficient water. Maybe there's the cost for recovery or response after a big threat. Maybe there's increased diseases because you haven't had clean water, or you've had some sort of sanitation issue. Or maybe it's just a really big inconvenience to folks, and that makes disgruntled ratepayers. But these consequences are the things, the ultimate issues that you're trying to avoid. And so thinking through how the sort of domino from a threat to the consequence functions, I think, is very important to the process. So for each different aspect of that vulnerability cycle between threats, systems, impacts, and consequences, there's interventions that you can plug in at each one of these areas, whether it be mitigation, adaptation, maybe you're coping with a disaster, and then you're learning from it so that you can prevent that threat in the future. There are different types of strategies or interventions you can take to make sure that you become more resilient. And so we're going to go through a couple different examples of these interventions. And again, these are just examples. What we're hoping you do is you go back to your leadership and you go back to your managers and you sit down and have these discussions about your specific utility and how this plays out in your utility. So an example of mitigation, right? So maybe it's an internal and acute issue. And so that's something like an accident. The threat is an accident. Something you can do to help mitigate that is develop a safety culture. And so that would be training and workforce development to make sure that accidents are less frequent and don't happen. Mitigation is by far the most cost-effective intervention. It's better to take care of an issue before it even happens. And so think about all the different mitigation strategies you might be able to put in to solidify yourself and make sure that the threats don't become some sort of catastrophe. The next intervention would be adaptation. So sometimes things occur outside of your control, and so the next step is to just be prepared before they become a disruption, right? So if you can't mitigate, maybe you have to adapt. And this might be something like if you know that you're going to have increased demand on your system because the population is increasing, maybe what you do to adapt is you promote water-saving technologies and use of reclaimed water. So maybe you do more education and outreach, but you start to address the fact that there's going to be an increased demand. You can't help that. You can't change that. So what you can do is go out there and help the community adapt to this increasing demand. And so what happens if a disruption does occur, right? So sometimes you can prepare and plan and hope that you don't end up having a disruption for your utility, but sometimes utilities just have disruptions. And so are you prepared then to cope with that disruption after the fact? So I think the easiest example of that is sort of having residents boil their water if there's concern for E. coli or some sort of spread of disease, right? That's a disruption. You couldn't really do anything about it, or it got to the point where it did occur. So what are you doing to cope with it after the fact? And again, these are thought processes and frameworks for you to have discussions at your utility with your leadership to make sure that you have in place plans to deal with all these different types of threats. So another important planning framework, aside from that one that I shared with you from the Exeter group, is just thinking about the hazards and identification vulnerability analysis. And really, this is just a way for you to think about vulnerabilities in a pretty strategic way, I would say. And the first step here is don't reinvent the wheel, right? Check to see what's already out there. There might already be assessments at your local city offices of emergency management. There might be assessments at the local county offices of emergency management, or maybe even at the state level. They might already have a pretty good analysis of what sort of threats and vulnerabilities might be out there. The next thing is to take an inventory of any incidents that have occurred specifically for your utility in the last 20 years, right? Knowing what has been vulnerable in the past might help you know what is going to be vulnerable in the future. And this sort of poses a bit of an issue because one of the biggest vulnerabilities for water utilities is an aging workforce, right? The average employee age in utility industries ranges from about 45 to 54. So with more than 25 years of experience, that's a lot of institutional knowledge, and that's great because that means you can call on someone to tell you what's happened in the last 20 years. But it's really important that we start having great record keeping, and that maybe you even have a disruption database so that you can catalog those incidents without necessarily having that institutional knowledge, because once those folks retire, you want to make sure that you still have the knowledge with you. And then you want to identify vulnerable areas, research the threats specific to your geography, which is becoming easier and easier. The projections and the science behind vulnerabilities sort of from a climate adaptation level is becoming more effective and easy to get. And so later on we'll share some resources that you might be able to use free of cost to help you think through some of those geographic threats. And then you want to develop a response plan to the most probable hazard, right? So if you're in Maine, you might not be likely to suffer from a lot of drought, and so planning for a drought might not be the most effective use of your time, whereas if you're in California, planning for fires and droughts is very important. And then once you've created this hazard identification assessment, you really want to make sure that you organize and train your employees and the leaders on the various scenarios so that once these threats present themselves, everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. So a couple things to consider when developing this vulnerability assessment are your distribution systems. For those of you who said you already have an asset management plan in place, that's fantastic. That should be a fairly easy thing for you to sort of assess because you're already keeping good tabs of it. You want to look at all your physical barriers, your water collection and treatment facilities, how you are managing and storing chemicals, how storage and distribution facilities, how are those being managed, and then also think about your electronic systems. Again, if the power grid goes down, you want to make sure that you guys are going to be okay and that you are well protected both from natural disasters, but also other types of threats that might come through a cyber system. And then you want to pair up those individual assets or systems components with a particular threat. So again, this is identifying particular threats and then seeing what's most vulnerable with those particular threats. So now I have a few frameworks for thinking through the resilience planning process. What are some strategies you might be able to implement with regards to resilience? So you thought through the frameworks, you thought about the threats and what might the impacts be, but what are some things you could actually start to do to mitigate and adapt to these threats that are coming down the pipeline? Well, when we're talking about flooding impacts, establishing regional interconnections can be very, very valuable, especially in the event of infrastructure damage or service interruption. So who's your neighbor and how can you plug into what they're doing to make sure that if a massive flood occurs, then you are not totally, your population isn't totally vulnerable and they have a plan and alternative. Earlier we talked about the electricity grid and making sure that you have alternative power supplies so that if a storm comes through, then you still can manage your electronics. Monitoring and inspecting infrastructure is important on a regular basis so that you can prepare them for floods. And then trying to maybe elevate or flood-proof particular assets that you know are on low-lying areas or are particularly vulnerable. And then you might want to join a mutual aid network. There's lots of these, such as the Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network, that is fantastic about peer-to-peer networking and sharing information across the region. What about changes in seasonal runoff? What can you do in that particular instance? So as we know, with increased temperature and shifting precipitation, patterns may cause more precipitation to fall, and instead of through snow, it's going to come in the form of rain. So this may result in all sorts of issues, including large-scale flooding, or maybe if there isn't any runoff, maybe there wasn't a lot of snow and so we have less water to deal with. But the most important thing here is that you monitor the precipitation, the snow melt, and the river discharges, so you might know what's going to happen down the pipeline. Develop water quality models and incorporate predictions of snowpack and runoff changes in these models. Update drought contingency plans to identify triggers that would result in demand management activities. And then diversify water supplies as best as you can. So maybe think about using recycled water or desalination or stormwater capture for particular usages. And then again, establish regional interconnections. We can't do this alone, and relying on your neighbors is very important. So increased runoff. Some things that you can do to help fortify yourself from increased runoffs is think about green infrastructure, think about distributed systems, or invest in watershed management plans, model potential stormwater impacts to your service area, start thinking about monitoring runoff with regards to vegetation and land use changes, and incorporate that data all into your models. This is going to be a big one, especially for the East Coast, that's going to be dealing with a lot more storm water issues. Start thinking about how do you implement these different strategies and techniques so that you can manage the volume that we will be expecting. And green infrastructure is also good for stress sewer systems. We could also think about reducing infiltration and inflow by managing assets better. Again, those of you already have an asset management plan, that's great. Knowing what is vulnerable, what needs to be updated is really important to make sure that our sewer systems aren't being unduly stressed. And then model potential stormwater flows to understand potential impacts to your service area. Modeling is really important. Things are going to be changing quickly, and being able to think through the impacts ahead of time can help us to prepare and plan. And then last but not least, and something I think we oftentimes overlook, engage the public often and frequently and all the time. Really, service disruptions can cause customers to lose confidence in their utilities' ability to provide clean and safe water to customers. And so managing customer expectations through education and helping the communities to be self-sufficient in the time of a crisis is really important. And you can do this through collaborative discussion sessions, adaptation options with local businesses, think about community adaptations with customers, you guys need to become marketers and get out there and talk to the public about how important and crucial your water system is, and help them understand why it's important to invest in this particular utility. And then if you're talking to them with frequency and you are doing a lot with regards to outreach and education, the conversation, that very challenging conversation about raising rates, can be a bit more palatable, and making sure that you do so in a way that includes them in the decision making, or at least lets them know that it's coming down the pipeline, and explaining to them why that's necessary, that can help them get on board and hopefully be supportive. And so quickly, just to ask another polling question.
If you could please select from one of the following for the question of what stage of resiliency planning do you currently need the most assistance with? You could choose communicating the need of resilience planning to decision makers, assessing projected impacts of climate change in your region, developing a comprehensive asset management plan, identifying appropriate resilience strategies for your utility, and educating ratepayers on the importance of resilience planning. And we'll leave that polling question open for another 10 seconds. And we'll leave it open for another 5 seconds. And getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. So as you can see, a majority, the pretty split between identifying resilience strategies for your utility and educating ratepayers on the importance of resilience planning. And back to you, Brandy.
Yeah, educating ratepayers, I think, is definitely one of the hardest things to do. It takes a lot of time and capacity to get out there and really start to build those relationships. And oftentimes, we're so busy dealing with the actual system itself that we don't have the bandwidth to actually get out there and get in front of people and let them know that, you know, while you don't see the system when it's running properly, it's very important to invest in it now before things go wrong. And so I think that's an issue people are trying to tackle all the time. This next section is kind of going to go through a couple of resources for planning, and hopefully some of these will provide you some insights and help about how you might want to be, how you might be able to talk about resilience to your ratepayers moving forward. So the first thing I'm going to bring to your attention, and you may or may not have seen some of these tools and resources in the past, but I think it's great just to reiterate them because they're free, and free is always good. Or most frequently, it's good. So the Climate Ready Water Utilities Guide from the Environmental Protection Agency is a really useful tool that if you haven't heard of it already, you might want to check it out. When you receive this PowerPoint, you'll see that there's a link at the bottom of the slide that will help guide you to this particular tool. And this guide is pretty fantastic. It's a guide for utilities to consider climate conditions, and it has regional climate change projections. And so you can go in and click on your region of the country, and it will inform you about what are the most likely, the biggest impacts in your region, whether it's going to more effectively impact the drinking water systems or the wastewater systems. And it's going to give you a planning checklist so that you could think through these things in a way that is important to your community. It'll also help you look through different adaptation options and give you a very basic guide to the cost, whether it's going to be a bit more costly, like expanding current resources by developing regional water connections, or whether it's going to be something that's fairly low cost by establishing mutual aid agreements with neighboring utilities, right? So establishing a mutual aid agreement doesn't really cost a whole lot other than maybe the time it takes to make those negotiations happen, but maybe investing in more green infrastructure is going to cost more. So this tool is really great because it gives you sort of, again, that regional climate change projections, so you know what's most likely going to threaten your region. And then it gives you some strategies and a checklist, which I'm always a fan of checklists because it makes it easy. It means somebody else has thought through some of those issues. You can really just go through and use that as a pretty good guide to your planning effort, at least on the front end. Another thing that this particular website has, which I think is phenomenal, is a climate change workshop planner. So if you wanted to do more outreach and education to your customers, if you wanted to put together a slideshow that you could take around to maybe different HOAs or maybe to community meetings to talk about climate change and how that's going to impact your utilities, this gives you the opportunity to create a quick and easy webinar, a workshop that you can both do activities from and put slides together, and it's very little effort on your part. You just click what you're looking for, what region you're in, what are the threats you want to talk about, what are your priorities, and it'll provide you the slides, the talking points, and activities to do with your ratepayers. Another tool that I think is pretty valuable is the Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool, CREAT for short. And so this is a tool that allows you to basically do scenario planning, and it allows you to catalog your critical assets. It allows you to outline economic consequences of those climate threats. You sign up. I believe this is also a free tool. You just walk through the steps. It asks you questions. You'll just input information, and it will really help you sort of kickstart your planning process. Again, it's free, and so I highly encourage you to tap into these resources. I believe these resources are all from the EPA, and so you know, you've already invested in making these tools available, so you might as well use them. And at the end of this particular tool process, it produces a risk and planning report. So you can go through that whole process online, and then it'll produce a report that'll help you think through these issues. If you're looking for case studies, maybe you need to convince your leadership that this is important or that this is useful, you can look on the EPA's Adaptation Case Studies website for the Creating Resilient Water Utilities, and that will give you various case studies that show what these different communities were facing and how they worked to combat those issues. And this could be a great tool for helping your leadership understand why this is important, or helping your residents understand why this is important. And then we talked about a little bit earlier, asset management is incredibly important, because how do you know how to plan for disruption when you don't even know what might be disrupted? So for those of you who haven't yet moved into some sort of asset management process, for those of you who are still a little bit further down on the resilience process, you might want to consider looking into some of these asset management resources that can help walk you through how to create an asset management plan, how to put together your asset management tools for doing upgrades and edits to your systems. And then last but not least, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but information sharing is really important. Network, 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 learn from your peers. Everyone is sort of suffering from the same issues with regards to strapped capacity, lack of resources, increasing demands, and so talk to other folks who have already started dealing with these issues. You can learn a lot. It's an essential, information sharing plays an essential role in the security and resilience of the water sector. Risk information can't be proprietary, and you have to be comfortable sharing it with other people so that we don't all keep making the same mistakes. Here are just two examples of networks that you might want to plug into. RAN, for example, the Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network, provides a network of utilities which can help other utilities to respond to and recover from emergencies. If you're not already plugged into that, please check it out. Please get involved. And then the Water Information Sharing and Analysis Center serves as an information platform for the sector. And members include hundreds of utilities serving more than 200 million people in the United States, as well as federal, state, and local agencies and consulting firms. So plug into these different networks so that you can learn more and learn from your peers. Maybe there's a community across the country that has the same demographics and is the same size, dealing with the same issues. Learning what they've done is really, really important. So that's all I have for now. I think now is time for questions, and I believe that Savannah will have a few more polling questions for you at the very end.
Thank you, Brandy. So we did receive one question so far. So an attendee asks, a water utility's key asset is the water resource, and there are methods to model the potential impacts of stresses such as climate change on the risk or assurance of supply. This attendee's water system generally uses between 98 and 99% assurance as a basis for planning. Have you considered this definitive, measurable, risk-based indicator? And if so, what percent assurance is typically used in other parts of the world?
Well, that is a very good question. And I will say that I have heard of that measurement and that metric, and I think it's a very good one. But depending on where you are in the process and where you are with regard to thinking through these strategies, that might be a bit ambitious to start with. And so I guess the answer is I don't know what else is going on in the rest of the world. I have heard of that particular strategy. And I think it is a very optimum goal to set, and one that I would encourage communities and utilities to strive for. But we tried to keep this particular presentation sort of higher level planning process thinking rather than getting into some of the weeds of the harder numbers.
Thank you, Brandy. So we don't have any more questions at this point, but if anybody else has any questions or would like to submit a question, and if it happens later, Brandy's contact information is available on the screen, and we can follow up with you offline. So before we do wrap up, I do have two more quick polling questions for you. And the first one is, if you would be interested in subscribing to the Environmental Finance Center blog. If you want to sign up for the blog but do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for the EFCN blog on the efcnetwork.org website. And leave that poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served, are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? Again, if you're unsure about technical assistance or do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can review the technical assistance form on the efcnetwork.org website. And we'll leave that poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close that poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, there is a survey link coming out to you all in the chat box. If you could just take 5 minutes out of your day to let us know how this session went. And also the AWWA CEU assistance email will also be provided in this chat message. And it looks like, so we just received another question, Brandy. Are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
So how do you find a balance between increasing infiltration to reduce runoff and increase groundwater recharge and decreasing infiltration to reduce impact on sewer systems?
Can you repeat that question, Savannah?
Of course. How do you find a balance between increasing infiltration to reduce runoff and increase groundwater recharge, while also decreasing infiltration to reduce impact to sewer systems? To the attendee that wrote this question, do you have another way of phrasing that? I just don't know if I'm coming across properly with that question. Well, I guess, Brandy, the first
Can you
part
share
of the
that
question.
so I can read it?
Yep. All right, coming through to you in the chat box.
So am I understanding this correct? And how do you find the balance between reducing runoff, really, infiltration to reduce runoff, versus reducing impact to sewer systems?
If the attendee that asked that question has the opportunity, yes, so that is what he means.
Sure. Well, that seems like a pretty technical question. And again, I'll just sort of default to the higher level process thinking. But if I understand that correctly, the concern is that as we increase infiltration so that we reduce runoff, we're also sort of putting a strain on our sewer systems because they're the ones that are having to deal with that increased infiltration that's not being run off on the surface. And I know this is probably sort of a cliche answer and not necessarily what you're thinking about, but from my understanding, you know, using adaptive management and increasing green infrastructure strategies is a great way to make sure that we are reducing runoff from storm events while not putting that same sort of stress on the sewer system. Because if we can have more green infrastructure strategies in place, then sort of the natural environment will be the one who adopts and takes up a lot of that increased runoff, and it's not necessarily being sort of pushed off to the sewer system. I think that's probably more basic than what you were looking for, but I'm also happy to look into that a bit more and get back to you if you want to share your email with Savannah.
Thanks, Randy, and I'll collect that information if the attendee wants to provide that. So at this point, no further questions have come in. Do you have a few more slides to go through, or would we like to wrap this up?
Nope, that's all I have. Thank you, Savannah.
You got it. So thank you, Brandy, so much for providing your expertise on resiliency planning, and thanks to all the attendees that joined us today. Again, if you have any questions, we can follow up with you offline, and we hope that you all have a great day. Thank you all.